almost every place I write about grief, that for me, the experience of grieving is really that divide of life before, and then life after.
Yeah.
And that is more resonant for me and for most people than, as we mentioned before, than the 5 stages of grief, because it is this significant divide. Like, this was my life before, and now this is my life after. And while I get to, in the after part, I get to bring some of the before with me. In the beginning, I didn't think I would get to. It took me time to get to a point where realizing, like, I'm still some of those things. I'm still some of those ways. I didn't completely, the me who's me didn't really vanish off the earth. It just felt in the beginning.
Hello, my grieving friends. It's your host, Lisa Keefauver here. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Now, just in case you're new to the show, yes, this is a podcast all about grief. We explore the expansiveness and pervasiveness of grief in our lives. What I've learned over my 20 plus years as a social worker and more than a decade I've spent now as a widow is that if we lean in, hold space, and bear witness for one another in the most difficult seasons of our lives, that's where true connection, true healing, and community building happens. And my guest today knows all about this. Gudger is the author of The Fifth Chamber, which Kirkus Review called an emotionally riveting memoir, raw and inspiring. I agree. She's been published in places like Newsweek, Real Simple Magazine, Columbia Journal, the Los Angeles Review, and more. She's been a Best of the Net nominee twice and has won a handful of essay contests too. I believe it. In March 2020, with her beloved daughter, she co-founded Coffee and Grief. It's a community that includes a monthly reading series focused on grief and their podcast called Coffee, Grief, and Gratitude. Anne's big purpose is to normalize grief, to give grief a microphone. And that's exactly what we did in today's episode. Today, Annie shares her journey of navigating love and grief after the accidental death of her husband when she was just 6 months pregnant with their son. As she shared in her extraordinary memoir, The Fifth Chamber, which spans 30 years of her life, she discusses the complexities of entering a new relationship while dealing with profound grief and the impact of shared grief on the relationship. Together, we explore themes such as shock, the nature of helpful and not so helpful grief support, along with the coping mechanisms she developed. Annie emphasizes the importance of curiosity and meaningful conversations in processing grief and highlights the therapeutic value of writing as a tool for healing. I was so thrilled to bring our off-air conversations on the air for you today. You'll see, Annie is a true gift, and you'll learn so much from this conversation. I promise. My friends, I cannot believe I get to say these words. Welcome, Annie Gudger, to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I am thrilled to be in conversation with you on the air, though I'm also grateful that we get to have conversations off the air too.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It is just a delight to get to share this space with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Listeners heard a little bit about your story at the top of the show and about your extraordinary memoir, The Fifth Chamber. We're going to spend a lot of time today diving into your story, your wisdom, your insight. And I'd like to ground us, though, as you know, in this show, in my work, is helping us unpack where we learned our grief beliefs so that we can decide whether or not they are serving us in this season of our life and of our grief. And so for many of us, those early lessons came from the implicit or explicit messages and behaviors that we absorbed from the adults in our lives in an early loss. And so I wonder whether we might start with you sharing a memory of an early loss and what were you being taught back then about what grief, might look like or should look like? Yeah.
It's such a good question. It's such a good question because it really does shape us. A big early loss for me was my grandfather dying when I was 9. And I mean, my family was unprepared for it. I was unprepared for it. He had cancer that progressed really quickly. But at 9, I didn't understand that. To me, he was here one day and then not. And what I learned what I learned did not really serve me well when I got older, because my family had such a hard time processing it that they shut down and turned inward. Um, I haven't had an aunt who I was very close with my whole life until she died when I was in college. And she was great. She was there with me and trying to explain what was going on. Um, my dad was so immersed in his own grief. He just really didn't take the time with his daughters, my two sisters and me, to explain what was going on. Um, and as I've said, and I've written about it in my book, like I felt like I didn't have any tools, right? Mm. In my devastating grief and losing my husband, that was part of my thing. Like, I don't have tools. I came from a family of my dad was an alcoholic. My mother was chronically depressed, right? And so what I knew, when there's great sadness, just stuff it away.
Yeah. Or numb it out, either way.
Numb it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for helping us to see what you learned, because I think each time our guests share, I share my own stories. Each time we share, we can start to see maybe some of the subconscious ways we should all over ourselves about what our actual lived grief experience is, and that the invitation there is not to, go back and to complain to our parents if we're still lucky to have them alive. And yet it's just an opportunity for us to shift our awareness, because so much of the unnecessary suffering, as I often say, I think, in my grief, and I feel like we've had this conversation off air before, is that gulf between what our lived experience is and the stories we're told or tell ourselves about what it should be. And so the only way we know how to shift that narrative is to sort of bring it to the light. So thank you for answering this question. It's been interesting to see the answers across time and space over these last 6 seasons of guests. And although all of our stories are different, there's such a common theme of numbing and distracting and avoiding.
Well, it is. Yeah. And then, as an adult, you get to choose. I got to choose, like, I'm going to learn how to do this.
Yeah.
I felt like I didn't have a choice. Although, yeah. I mean, we always have a choice. But I was
you could have chosen numbness and distraction. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, that's what was familiar. But I also knew that there was a way I could get through it in a healthier way than that. And like I said, I mean, at the time I didn't think about the fact that I was choosing something different. I just felt really compelled to get help, to go to therapy, to find my way through. That didn't have anything to do with drinking my way through.
Right. Or numbing or bypassing your way. Yeah. Well, I want to get to that, because you were not very much of an adult, really, 28 only, when this profound loss happened to you. So, at 28, I feel like we're just still figuring out sort of the ground beneath us. And so I want to get there, but I want to invite Kent into the room too, because as much as we're going to talk about the loss and how you navigated the world in the wake of his death, I always like to bring our people here into the room. So it seems to me, getting to read your exquisite memoir, if you're watching The Fifth Chamber, here's this beautiful blue cover. We got to know Kent and the vibrancy, and you all were adventurers together, quite extraordinary. But tell us just a little bit about how Kent came into your life and what his presence in your life meant, just so that we have the context of.
Yeah. No, one of the things I love with you, because I want to it's so important to me that I keep that vibrancy of him alive and who he was. And he was a very loving, kind, smart, funny person, full of adventure. We were avid outdoor people. And he was also just silly. Like, he loved to dance with me in the kitchen, and he would sing this fake opera that was hilarious. And actually, he had a decent voice, but he didn't think he did. So then he just would make it funny. And we traveled together when we were only married for 3.5 years. And when we were married for a year, we quit our jobs and went and traveled in Europe. And I will always be so grateful that we took that time. And both of our families were like, "Oh, no, you should be saving your money for a house." And we were like, "We're going to go have an adventure." Um,
Yeah.
and we did. And it was one of the things after he died, all of our families were like, oh, we're so glad you went and did that.
Yeah.
That we kind of bucked conventional wisdom and just thought, this is a time we can do it. There's just the two of us. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, and it's like I have all those really sweet memories of just really being partners. We thought we would grow old and gray together, and we didn't have that privilege, but we really did pack a lot of life into 5 years, which is like the total amount of time that I knew him.
Yeah.
And a thing I always say about him, which no one's asked me this for a bit, but I always felt like he was such a beautiful human. And I was so grateful to even know him, right? And to be married to him, I was like, my gosh, I got the prize.
Yeah.
Prize.
Yeah.
It's like, I'd be happy just to be his friend, but he's my partner.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of Kent. And I just want to say, for those who aren't watching on YouTube, if you're listening, um, just being able to watch you light up as you brought Kent into the room and brought him into our lives. And it touched my heart and reminded me of, I felt the very same way about Eric. Was like, I would look at him sometimes and just think like, I don't know, but I'm so grateful, right? And also just the reminder. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just thinking because I think that we feel similarly. It's that thing like,
Yeah.
I must have done something right. I must have done something good to have all this come into my life.
It was such a surprise. And I know you described a little bit in the book, kind of the circumstances around how you met. And similarly, like, I just didn't see it coming. And then, wham, there he was. And also just your reminder that, we might not all be able to quit our jobs and, backpack in Europe, but, remember to be present and to celebrate and luxuriate in what is in front of us, to what are we going to do with this one wild and precious life, as Mary Oliver invites us to consider. One of the many things, unfortunately, that most of us need in our lives is a profound loss, to remember that. And I just love, as a part of your story, that you both really leaned into that regardless. And it's one of the things I imagine that allows you to carry Kent in your heart and your grief in your heart in a way with joy, because you really squeezed in a lot of life in 5 years together.
It's true. We
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. So I know we have a lot of folks who listen to the show who have experienced not just the death of a partner or a spouse, which we're going to talk about today, but also the uniqueness of experiencing a death loss that is accidental, that is surprising, that is, and again, this is no way to grade, this is not being a grief thief or we're comparing, but it is a unique and different experience compared to, let's say, a long-term chronic illness or terminal illness or some other circumstance. So you were just 28. You and Kent were getting ready to start a family. You were pregnant with your son, Jake, 6 months, I want to say. What do you want us to know about the story? Again, I'm not into the Kardashian voyeurism, but what's important for us to know in the context of how his death, in particular being accidental, maybe even impacted how you began to navigate early grief?
Well, it was accidental. He was on his way to go night skiing and was in a car accident on the mountain road. He didn't make it to the mountain that night. We had just been at my 6 month baby checkup, and we were there together. And that was the last time I saw him, and I got to hug him goodbye. And yeah, and I had this, which I write about, like I had this really strong feeling I didn't want him to go, but I also knew like that wasn't who we were. Like I wasn't the clingy girlfriend or the clingy wife, and he just wanted to get in as much skiing as he could before Jake got here. So I let him go, and that was the last time I saw him alive. And really, it was so unreal to me, right?
Yeah.
Sudden loss. It was so unbelievable to me. And it's a thing that people say, and I definitely experienced it. Like it didn't feel real to me, actually, until Jake was born. And so that was 3 months, right? So when people talk about, and we can talk about this, and I do not I'm not an advocate of the 5 stages of grief. I think that just gives us language to talk about,
Yeah.
but it
Yes.
doesn't, grief is not tidy. It doesn't progress like that. But when we talk about being numb,
Yes.
mine maybe lasted longer. I don't know. Again, like nobody, I never wanted to be, I just wanted to be part of the narrative, right?
Yes.
It's not a, I don't,
Shock and numbness is
yeah,
very real.
it's
It's
very real.
very real, regardless of the kind of loss and depending on the kind of loss and your own sort of supports and circumstances, it can last for some longer than others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me, I mean, I've said it in hindsight. I didn't think it going through it, but in hindsight, I really do feel like it was sort of this grace that my body just let me be in shock and numb until Jake was born, because I had another 3 months to carry my baby and I didn't want anything to happen to him. And I think it was grace in my life that it just was not real to me. And then when Jake was born and I brought him home from the hospital and it was just me and Jake, then it started to become real to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I so appreciate you naming that and putting it in context. Like, yes, agree that 5 stages is not actually the description of how we move forward in grief. And yet I do think that every griever experiences some level of shock and numbness. And this is a place where I would say, I'm going to get out my little speech about how emotions aren't and nervous system reactions aren't good or bad. They just are. And then it's what we do with them. But I think all the time about how fortunate we are in a way as humans to have this response of shock and numbness. It is a protective factor because we aren't able to process all at once the sort of larger than life catastrophe that is happening to us. And that for some of us, it can take longer. And so, yeah, just to acknowledge that. And also, by the way, recognizing that here you had to turn, we think about this all the time. Like my daughter was 7 when Eric died. Many of us have to take care of other people, but here you were having a really physiological experience of having to take care of your son who was in your body. Even in the shock, do you think back, like, were you able to sleep? Were you able to get nutrition? How were you able to turn that care towards him even as you were in shock? And
I mean, like most people, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I lost weight. Here I am 6 months pregnant when people are usually gaining weight, and I lost weight. When I would go to my OB appointments, Dr. Hoagland, who I just adored, would say to me at the end of my appointment, "Now go get a shake and some fries." And I would laugh and I would go, "Is that what you tell all your patients?" And he's like, "No, most of them I'm saying maybe slow down on the shakes and fries."
yeah, yeah,
But it's like I had a great support system around me. I had my family who just came in and held me up. My mom literally made dinner for me a couple nights a week because she knew I wasn't eating. And people sat with me and watched me eat because I couldn't, right? Couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. All those things were still happening. But I also had this awareness that there was life in me, right? Like Jake was kicking and moving and doing his thing. And, so I did my best. I stopped doing everything else. I think that's part of how I early took care of myself and Jake. I did go back and teach a class, which was wild in hindsight.
I was going to say, I remember reading because I feel we both went back to work like 2 weeks after our partners died. And yeah, I look back on that now and I'm like, what in the world? But
yeah, I did. I still had a class that I went and taught, and that was wild. That's just like convention, right? And because you don't know, I didn't know.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, the practical part, which I always like to tell people too, I needed the health insurance, right? I needed to keep my health insurance. And I was a robot teacher, man. I was like, at the end of that term, I went and told my boss, asked her if we could give everybody a refund. And she was like, "No, I'm sure, fine." I'm like, "Well, I'm pretty sure I was awful."
Yeah. You do what you can.
You do what you can.
Yeah.
But everything else, my world just got really small. Right.
Yeah. I often ask people to describe their experience of how people showed up or didn't show up, the surprise that many of us experience about the people who were capable of showing up and how that doesn't necessarily align with who you thought would, and vice versa. And I think in your particular situation, I'm curious because here you might have had a community who was preparing to show up for you as new mom, right? They were like getting ready to throw the baby showers and the parties. And so what do you notice when you look back? And again, this was many, many years ago. This was decades ago, long before any kind of grief literacy that we are starting to see emerge, in this last decade or so. What do you notice about that time when you reflect back about people's capacity to be with you and to be of support to you in those early months and maybe even years?
What you said is so true. Like the people who you think are just going to be at your side no matter what, they got you. Some people don't have the capacity. And there were people like that in my life who were like anything, anytime. And then they went quiet. And then there were the surprise people. So I had a couple of those. I was really hurt by the people who I thought would show up and who weren't capable. And it took me time to realize like, oh, they just didn't have it in them. Right. But then my family was great. My family is awesome. My sisters and my parents. Then I had a couple, Leo and Trisha, who are sort of in my book. Leo and Kent were really good friends in college, and I'd only met them a couple of times, right? So I did not know them. And here I lived in Washington. I was in Federal Way at the time, and they were in Vancouver, BC. So it's a drive. They're not in my neighborhood, but they came down regularly. They're the people who showed up at my house. This will make me cry. Showed up at my house and said, where are you going to put the baby? And I was like, well, there's another bedroom that I would basically use as a storeroom. And they're like, yeah, but it's a storeroom.
Stuff. Yeah.
Full of stuff. So they literally came down for a weekend and turned that room into a nursery for me. Like they did these physical things that I couldn't wrap my mind around.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful thing. And it's something that I say to people regularly when people ask me, like, what do you say to people? I'm like, ask the specific things. Don't ask, what can I do? Because nobody has the answer to that. Right. But give people some options. And so they did. And initially, I always remember they're clearing out that room and Leo was bringing me, there were a whole bunch of, Kent was a genius and a physicist and had a library, a huge library. I was going to say something that I'm not, this huge.
Yeah.
And so Leo started bringing me books like, did I want to keep them? And I was like, don't ask me. Just do whatever you want. I don't, I'm probably not going to read those books. I read lots of books, but I am not a physicist. Although some of it, I always like, because there's some of that in my writing always, because it fascinates me. And I had the pleasure of living and loving a physicist for a while, but I was just like, just do whatever. And they did. Right. And they did beautiful things like that. They would show up with food. They showed up to take me out to dinner one time. And I was like, I don't want to.
I know.
I'm going out to dinner and having an empty chair next to me. And everybody wants to put their purses there where it's supposed to be my husband. Let's not do that. Let's stay in, and another friend who did similarly would just show up and do one of the things that I was like, why is this happening? It felt like I don't know how it was for you, but it felt like my house started falling apart.
Yes.
Like Kent wasn't there. And all of a sudden things were breaking, things needed. And I was like at a loss because he had taken care of all those things. So having friends show up and help fix the washing machine, assemble a bookcase for me, make the baby room. Those were some of the most beautiful moments early on.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that and for helping us all remember. I think particularly I want to highlight or draw out the way in which you invited us to sort of be specific in our offers of help, and also to have it not be about us, by the way, to just keep showing up even when the person can't make that decision. And also just to draw out, one of the ways in which grief keeps metabolizing and shifting and also triggering us along the way are all of these signs of the secondary losses that we experience, to your point of like, when the refrigerator breaks down, I'm the one now who has to figure out even just to call, who do I call and how do I call? And it's going to be on me. And on top of having grief brain, which is very real and makes every decision feel nearly impossible. So Yeah, just to remind us of the grace of that. And that also can teach those of us who are grief supporters, which, by the way, newsflash, 100% of us are both going to experience grief multiple times in our lives and be grief supporters or have the potential to be grief supporters, right? And so to be thoughtful about all of the day-to-day mundaneness of life in the wake of loss is so unbearable sometimes. And that place, right, where we can help. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. This part of the conversation with Anne has me thinking about the both and of grief support. It's something I often talk about when I'm delivering workshops or talks on this subject. On the one hand, it's not our job to fix the griever because grief isn't a sign the person is broken. It's simply a normal response to loss. And grief takes a cognitive, emotional, physical toll on the griever. So showing up in practical ways to help the griever take care of the everyday tasks of life that feel out of reach is a profoundly helpful way to deliver grief support. When we come back, Anne shares some of the beautiful ways the people in her life showed up to help her as she was, on the one hand, grieving the love of her life, and the other, preparing to bring their child into the world. I wonder if you're looking for more grief resources, access to practices and tools that will help this journey of grief suck a little bit less, or maybe just more ways to connect with me and my work. Currently, I drop into your inbox with my not-so-regular newsletter to share a bit of wisdom I think you might want to know about. Sometimes that takes the form of essays, or a journal prompt, or even a guided meditation that will help ease your suffering. Other times it includes news about events I'm hosting or participating in that I think you might like. I often invite you to write me a personal note too, answering a question I have about how you're moving through your grief. Though I currently show up in your inboxes in the form of that newsletter, I'm making a change. Why? Because now more than ever, I'm passionate about creating meaningful, intentional community and offering you more in-depth insight into my work. Now, life is happening so fast, and I want a place for us to gather where we can slow down, dive in, and figure out how to metabolize it all together. So, drum roll please, I'm launching a Substack called AFGO with Lisa Keefauver. AFGO, if you haven't heard me talk about it on the show, from the stage, or in my book, stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yes, of course, I had to get in a judicious use of cussing, but rest assured, my friends, like this show and really everything I do, it will offer thoughtful, meaningful, and practical guidance on how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. You can find the link at my website at lisakeefauver.com or by heading directly to Substack and signing up at afgowithlisakeefauver.com.
Yeah. And I was thinking as I'm listening to you, it's so true. I also like a woman who I was already close friends with, but became incredibly close with her. She would, after Jake was here, she would literally like come to my house and put us both in the car with all the baby things when I couldn't even think about how do you pack the diaper bag, right? She has a son 6 months older than Jake, and she knew what she was doing. She was all the things. So she would like load us up, pack us up, and take her to her house. And I'd stay for a couple of days. And I just felt so cared for.
Yeah, I love that so much. And, I also want to acknowledge that each of us at different phases in our life, and depending on the loss, because a partner loss can get a lot of attention. But as you well know, because you're in this field too, there are other people who might be listening who have a friend loss or some other loss that devastates them, but the world doesn't show up in that same way. And so this is just a reminder to those of you who are listening, if this is sounding resonant, but it's a friend of yours who's lost a friend or a cousin or somebody else, the profound shock and overwhelm that they might be feeling might require the same kind of friendship and grief support that you're talking about here today. We can all offer that in our way, regardless of the type of loss. Yeah.
Absolutely.
One of the things that, there was so much, and I appreciate it in the book. And if you're watching again, you can see, y'all, it's just sticky tabbed and
I love
noted
all
as
the sticky tabs. That makes me so happy.
I want to talk a little bit about when you arrived at the grief support group, and I might even read a little passage. I loved it for so many reasons because it was so resonant and true, but also because it included so many curse words, which, as you know, is my favorite. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was sort of like zooming out a little bit, and the way in which you structured your book. Each chapter moves back and forth from before, after, before, after, before, after, kind of the title of each chapter as you move through the book. Tell us a little bit about why, what does that mean to you now, even sort of now that you're on the other side of publishing the book and hearing back from readers. Tell us a little bit about the before and after structure.
The before and after structure came out of really writing about it. It wasn't, I didn't think in the beginning, like that's the thing, is you're creating the book, you just have to write the book. I did not, the before and after came way later.
Yeah.
But I write in there, and almost every place I write about grief, that for me, the experience of grieving is really that divide of life before, and then life after. And that is more resonant for me and for most people than, as we mentioned before, than the 5 stages of grief, because it is this significant divide. Like, this was my life before, and now this is my life after. And while I get to, in the after part, I get to bring some of the before with me. Yes. In the beginning, I didn't think I would get to. It took me time to get to a point where realizing, like, I'm still some of those things. I'm still some of those ways. I didn't completely, the me who's me didn't really vanish off the earth. It just felt in the beginning. But as I was working on it, and I really wanted, my book covers a huge expanse of time. It starts with Jake being born. It ends with him getting married. And, how old was he? He was 30 when he got married, right?
Yeah.
It really is this 30-year span. So not only did my goal was, I had lots of goals, but I really wanted to be true to the story.
Yes.
Also wanted to be able to give the long view, because I have the long view now. And I wanted to hold my readers. So I didn't want you to have any confusion, like, where are we? What's happening?
Yes.
And so that's when I landed on the before and after. I'm like, okay, now you know. And I joked with my editor that there could be like before chapters and after chapters. And it's like, let's not get cute about it. Let's just stay with this.
Well, I loved it so much for 2 reasons. One, I did think as a reader, it helped sort of orient me. But also, I think the way that you paired them together helped us understand the context of really how life shifts in the wake of profound loss, and the way you paired some of the stories that you told literally back to back from one chapter to the next, I think was so profound. And though, again, amplifying what you just said, or sort of lifting up what you just said, which is we do get to bring the pieces of us and the pieces of our person with us forward, although in the beginning that feels absolutely impossible. If it's a profound loss, we all know when that moment is, and that there was a real shift in time and shift in the path of our lives, or the trajectory, as I often say, of our lives. And so to just name it and to see that each chapter over chapter, I really felt, as a reader, but also, of course, as a griever myself, who has my own before and afters, that was really, in a way, affirming or sort of comforting to me to be able to think about the way I can identify those places. So yeah, I appreciate that as a reader, and you all will too when you read this book. I also appreciate, as I said, the warmth, your storytelling, the insight that you bring, and also the humor. And of course, love a good curse word. This show is, grief is a sneaky bitch. So what are you going to do? And I have learned, I used to say, I don't know if it's validated, but I have heard since that there are data studies that there is a therapeutic value to swearing. So just want to put that out there.
I'm all for it.
But one of the things I want to talk to, speaking of moving into the after and how we begin to expand the story of our lives, which is how I sort of think about it. In the beginning, grief is our whole story, and then we begin to live a life around it and we expand our story. One of them was you taking that next step to move beyond the support of your friends and family and to join a support group, where you were immediately confronted with this inevitable thing that confronts those of us who've lost a partner, which is the idea of dating again someday. And it's a bit of a passage, but I just loved it so much because I thought it really spoke to the experience of the shock. You know, that, again, speaking of before and after, there's a time as a widow, as a widower, as somebody who's lost a partner, where you can never imagine being with somebody else. And then when people say things to you about it, you're so vilely, viscerally disgusted and angry. And I remember many people said to me, "You're young, you're beautiful, you'll find love again." And it took everything I had not to literally punch them in the face or tell them to fuck off. I may or may not have done that. But you talked about arriving at a group thinking, okay, here's going to be a community of people I can relate to. And then you meet, I think her name is Maddie, you know, and this is what you shared is just so beautiful. You said a blonde, maybe Maddie, brushed crumbs off her skirt or rubbed them in, hard to tell. She races here during lunch, she told me, eats in the car. Next time she'll rub egg salad from the corners of her mouth, but the smell of egg and mayo will linger. I just love the detail in your stories. I'm single and going on a date, Maddie announced, leaning in so far I thought she'd tip over. My thoughts spun, what the fuck? Single? Date? My head squeezed where a ponytail would be if my hair were longer. Whites of my eyes circled my irises, brows tented. What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck? I was here for oceans of tears, mixing hurt, anger, regret. I was here for stories about broken dishes, burned lingerie, how they slept during the day and couldn't sleep at night, how they ate too much or how they didn't eat, how they drank too much or didn't, how they couldn't see past today or even this minute, how they missed their husbands with every body cell. Not moon-faced, curly-head Maddie announcing independence from grief, single, dating, holy fuck of everything. When? When? Asked a brunette, Sarah maybe, in a cocoa-colored pantsuit with a pale pink blouse, a high ruffle framed for her kind face. This weekend. I'll tell you about it next time. Maddie with her elfin grin and Rachel cherub cheeks. I hated Maddie. I didn't feel inspired like I could be Maddie someday. I felt pissed and resentful. I wanted the widow and fucked group. That's what you said, right? So tell us a little bit, I mean, besides just loving your writing and your storytelling ability, what is, and your F-bombs, what does it feel like when you're in that chasm between where somebody else is in their grief journey and yours, particularly as a widow and as it came to dating? Because we will go on, spoiler alert, that you did end up dating and finding another love of a life. But tell me, can you remember being back in that time for those who are listening of that, that crossroad?
I absolutely do, because like you said, I mean, people said similar things to me they said to you. People said to me all the time, "Oh, you're so young." I was 28, but I felt like I was 95. And that whole, like, you know, you're young, you'll find someone else. I had that similar, like this very visceral, angry response to that, because I had my soulmate and he died. And so don't tell me that.
Like it was a replaceable thing, like, oh, your shirt got torn, I'm just going to get a new shirt, is how it felt to me anyways.
That is how it felt. That's how it, like, oh, those are worn out, you can get another pair. And actually, this is not in the book, but I will say it since we're talking about crazy things people say to you. When I was, can I say this? I'm saying it. So at Kent's funeral, somebody came up to me and told me I needed to start dating because my baby needed a father. No, that's my trump card. When people are like, what are the ridiculous things people have said to you? I'm like, wait, I got one. And one of my sisters, thank God for my sisters, one of my sisters was close by and I grabbed her and I looked at my sister. I didn't even look at the person who said it. I looked at my sister and said, get her away from me. That's all I could think was like, just.
Yeah, because otherwise.
But that was early on. By the time I went to group, I really was like, okay, I'm gonna meet people like me. We were all under 40 and we all had children. That was part of the area. I was the youngest and Jake was, as I say, the youngest. But to then meet these women who just look so normal, right? They were like a group of women chatting and laughing. And I honestly, I don't remember how many times I went before I talked. I didn't talk because I trusted my therapist, right? I'd been seeing her individually and it was her group. I trusted her, but I just didn't see myself in those women. And especially that really did happen the very, very first time I went, that Maddie was like, I'm single and I'm going on a date. And I'm just like, I'm still married. How I,
Yes.
you know, but it really was like, my intuition's really good. It really was me trusting my intuition and trusting my heart. And I just kept going back to that group. And at some point, I don't know when, I shifted from like, I could never be like you to like, oh, one day I could be like you. One day I could be like you. And that was a great solace to me. And they were so, I mean, those women, I always say, like, they helped me save my life, right? They were just so kind and so loving. And when I did start to talk, like any little thing I said, they were so attentive, right? It's like I'd been the silent one in the room. They were waiting for me to join them. And they all knew they'd all been widowed longer than I had been, right? So they weren't, they were very welcoming, very loving. And, but it was a weird space to be in because I was, I was so not ready to even consider dating, much less being, the whole single thing. I felt
Yeah.
married. I felt
Yeah.
married or I felt widowed, but I didn't feel single. Like for me, even like that shifting from
Yes.
being widowed to being single, that was a big leap.
Yeah. Well, I think that particular leap, although I think we could expand it out to any kind of loss, really reminds me, and I feel like we've had this conversation off air, but is the way your identity we are remade. We are remade over and over again in the wake of loss. And that's part of what moving forward with our grief is, and to being with our grief is we, yes, there's this before and after, but we are remade, meaning our identities, how we see ourselves, how we see our place in the world is remade over and over again. And it's not done in one fell swoop. It's done in these little baby steps. And sometimes it's done underneath the surface and you don't even know what's happening until you find yourself one day seeing the world differently, or answering somebody, I'm single versus widowed, or whatever that case may be. Like the work is happening underneath. Was that your experience, or has been your experience as you've been navigating loss, the way we're sort of remade and our identity is remade over and
Absolutely.
over again? Yeah.
And I mean, I know that I've written it, but there was a point where I really realized um, that being widowed was something that happened to me. It wasn't who I was, right?
Yes.
'Cause for quite a while, it felt like that's who I am. That was
Yes.
my identity. In the beginning, like I did not want to be that. Like
Of
the
course.
whole like I did not want to be widowed. I did not want to call myself that. I couldn't see myself as that. I felt like I said, like, you continue to feel married because I wore my wedding ring. I here my mom who was more conservative and old fashioned in some ways, she was like, please at least wear your wedding ring until Jake gets here. Because she was concerned that I was pregnant. I'm like, Ma, plenty of women are pregnant and
Yes. Also,
married
least of my problems.
or don't wear rings. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like I don't really care about, that was, that cracked me up. But, yeah, really like shifting that, like you said, it's so true. And I think it's always true in life that we are, we're our little hermit crabs, right?
Yes.
As we keep remaking our identity and we outgrow that one and then we go find the next one, but we take the essence of us with us. And identity is powerful and shifting from,
Always, and it's always transforming. By the way,
yeah,
it's just these thresholds that we pass through. Often these thresholds of loss have a way of really remaking us. But look, even if you haven't experienced profound loss, which if you're listening to the show, you probably have, but you're not the you that you were when you were 15 or even 20 or 25, even if a
yes,
profound loss hasn't, thank goodness. I mean, yes, exactly. And really the invitation, I think, and or the demand, depending on how you see it, of a profound loss in the grieving process is to bring intention to the remaking and to the rebuilding and to the shifting of our identity. Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I so agree with that.
That's
Um,
beautiful. Well, but so there you were, at some point after finding this group, and as I think you said, which I really appreciate, listening to the intuition that even though you wanted to tell this woman to F off, you were willing to stay, that there was something here that was going to be good for you. You got to the point where you were ready to date, and in comes Scott. Yeah. So this is another love story of a lifetime that's now been lasting, what are we on, 25
years.
35 years. So maybe the perspective of that young widowed or newly singled you versus now when you think back. But that's a threshold that is really hard for so many people who've lost a partner, who've lost a love. How was it for you then?
I mean, it was intense. For one, I mean, I've written about it. I joked that I was going to need to kiss at least 5 toads, and not in the old toad to prince thing, but just like I had got to experiment. And
yeah,
I had my love person, and I'm going to have to do some experimenting. And then I met Scott. We were introduced by friends. So that helped, by 2 people who knew us and loved us. And he was great. So he's just a fabulous human. But part of why I could get to know him and get close to him is he was so just really gentle with me. Like from the start, he was like, maybe we're just going to be friends. And I would thought, I could have another friend. I could do that. Right. So he was never like, I am here for, he didn't like swoop in. He was very cautious. He was brilliant with Jake, right? Because here I have my adorable little boy, and he like let Jake come to him. He didn't swoop in. He didn't try to impress me with, what a great guy he was and how good he was with my kid. He just really let Jake, kind of ignored him in a really good way and let Jake come to him, which I loved. But I mean, I had a ton of self-doubt. I mean, even the first date that we went on, I was a mess, right? Like because I just thought, I'm not ready. I don't want to go. Up until, thank goodness we didn't have cell phones then, or I probably would have texted him and told him to forget it, right? And up, like, even the day of, all day long, I was like, I'm going to call him and tell him to forget it. I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. And then I was like, no, just, you've been through a lot, honey. That's what I kept telling myself. You've been through a lot. You can just go out and have fun. It doesn't have to be anything. Just, your friends wouldn't have you meet him if he wasn't a good guy, but just meet him and just have fun. Don't make it anything more than that, which is how I got myself to go. And it was, I mean, I held him at arm's length for quite a while. That is the truth, because I didn't think I was ready to really be in a relationship, but here he was. And then a thing, and I just barely touched on it in the book. I'm writing more about it now in my next book. When I met him, we'd only been dating for like 6 weeks. So we're in the early dating. Things are fun, and we're just things are light and fun. We're just kind of being silly together. And it was such a relief to be able to be playful after I had just been so sad, right? I really welcomed that. And then sadly, Scott's brother died in a logging accident. So also super sudden, unexpected, young man. He was my age. It's going to make me cry. And that was another huge threshold for us. Like, I knew either I'm going to be in relationship with this person or I'm not, because now he has this huge grief, and it's not possible just to be in the light, flirty, playful, we're just done part of a relationship when now your brother just died.
When we come back, Anne allows us to see in her own story how actually turning towards and opening up to the grief both she and Scott were experiencing deepened their connection, and that it invited them to be more intentional and present to the everyday delights of living and even courtship, too. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Writing is one beautiful way to creatively explore your loss. But as we heard from a previous guest, Jamie Thrower, ritual and creativity can also help us metabolize our sorrow. That's why I am thrilled to share that Jamie and I are teaming up and offering a place of shelter in the overwhelm, exploring how we create a safe and sacred container for our grief. Alongside an intimate gathering of fellow grievers, we'll explore and learn about these 5 themes: the cross-cultural history and benefits of rituals in grief, key elements involved in altar building, the role of creativity in metabolizing and alchemizing our sorrow, the positive impact of creative activities on our nervous system, And finally, how mindfulness of the stories we tell ourselves and others can help us hold the weight of grief. This is a 3-hour online, interactive, and intimate workshop experience. Together, we will explore the importance of rituals and creativity in grief by listening, watching, talking, writing, drawing, creating, playing, meditating, and most of all, gathering in sacred community with one another. To sign up for this workshop or learn about future offerings, visit lisakeefauver.com/workshops and events. So one of the things that you reminded us there is that, you had to, as you're trusting yourself with this love, with Scott, with this new relationship, and then he experiences this profound loss, you're trying to have to balance sort of the lightness of early dating and the weight of carrying heavy grief. And that fact that he ended up becoming a griever in that early time meant that you both had to sort of figure out, how do we do this? How do we do light and fluffy dating, but also really step full in? And it sounds like, not that it was such a simple decision, but that his loss matching your loss meant that you really made a choice to step in, and not that it was a singular choice. Or how do you think about that time of that transition?
Well, it was hard, right? It wasn't easy. It wasn't like, okay, this is what's in front of me, and now I'm going to say yes to this. That's all this is going to be. It would have been easy. It was hard. It was, I just knew, like, in my heart and soul that if I was going to be in a relationship with him, it was going to be different than it had been that early part of getting to know him, right? And I also knew, so when they cry, I'm really good with other people's grief. I am. It's one of the things that I learned, and it's one of the huge things I've learned. I knew that I had the capacity just to be with him, right? I knew I couldn't fix anything. I knew there was no magic wand, all the things that I knew from my own experience, but I also knew in that I had the capacity just to be with him if that's what he wanted and what I wanted. I mean, like I said, it wasn't easy. There was still a lot of me going back and forth, a lot of my self-doubt. I still felt like I was being disloyal to Kent, even though if my first husband could come through and say, go have a life, he would have said it. I mean,
yes,
I felt him saying it around me all the time, but if he literally could have shown at my door, or if I could literally get that letter in the mail, man, it would have said, I love you, go have a life, right? But it's all that guilt and that just accompanies it. It's just part of it.
right. Which is, I mean, dating is hard enough, not including grief, and then even as single parent, it's its own complication. And then to have two people who are in the midst of grief, there's a lot of negotiating. But also, I wonder for you, I mean, we were talking about this earlier on the air, like, we would trade it all away to have our person back, of course, but there is something about being in the presence of somebody who also knows what it's like to be in the womb of grief, or to be in the, belly of the beast, as they say, and that it can invite you to just get to the heart of things. And I wonder if that's part of what you and Scott experienced in that early time together, is like getting to the heart of what it means to be in this world. And yeah,
I do. I absolutely think it did. And, grief like strips away all of our facades.
yes.
It just does. Like, you are who you are to your core. And I got to see that in him, and he got to see it in me, and I got to both walk by him and not, and just let him do it the way he needed to do it. And one of the beautiful things that happens for us as two humans, and then for him within his family, part of why I could let Scott into my life even before his brother died was he had his own grief story. And his father died when Scott was only 16. So he had this profound father loss, and their grief talk, as I'd say about it, in their family dried up early on. His mother remarried 6 months later and just decided she was going to be happy and good, and they stopped grieving as a family. And then I'm in their life, and then Ed died, and part of what I got to see that I got to bring in, not in words, more in just my essence, was like, it's okay. We can talk about it. And Scott and I would talk about things. And he shared a lot then about his own father loss. And he would actually, this always makes me cry, but he would go back and talk to his mom about things they hadn't talked about when he was a teenager, right? Because he said, Mom, I don't know how it was for you, but Annie said at this stage, here's where she was. And really, like, how was it for you? And so they started having this dialogue that they never had, right? And to me, I was like, okay, if that's what comes out of this,
Yeah.
that's a huge blessing. So it is like, you get, we talked about earlier, like, I just think with people who have been in the fire, through the fire, or in the fire, there's this, you get to have a deeper, more meaningful conversation if you choose to.
Yeah. Sort of an initiation into a different way of being in the world. And we get to, hit the fast forward, like watch towards the series through, which is, 30 years later, you and Scott are still together and in love. But one of the things that I wanted to touch on, maybe as we begin to close the conversation, because I think for those of us who've experienced the hard thing, like it's not an intellectual exercise that the people that we love die. It's a really visceral, embodied truth that we know that you can put your love, everything that we lose is because we loved them first. And so can be, whether it's an accidental loss, a long prolonged illness, even somebody dying at an older age, those losses can instill in us a kind of hypervigilance or a kind of fear or a kind of worry, which to a conversation we've had before, which can make you choose to numb off or wall off, that might be drugging or drinking or whatever, or we have to be able to hold the both with that it's worth the risk of love. And sometimes our physiological body is in overdrive, trying to keep us safe. And that shows up for many of us in anxiety or in hypervigilance. That certainly has shown up in my life. And though I work to have it not be in control over the time, I've come to accept that hypervigilance is a part of the me and the after, to your before after. How has hypervigilance shown up for you, and how do you think about your relationship with that in your life over the years since Kent's death?
Well, early on, it really, could totally hijack me. Like, I worried that everybody was going to die. I worried my parents, my sisters, my friends. I worried that if I knew and loved you, you're going to die. There was no more thinking like, oh, when you live to be 90, whatever. I knew that that could happen in a heartbeat. One of my huge things was, was around cars, right?
Yeah,
Like,
of course.
everybody, we're all good. Everybody has a safe car. But I was super vigilant with my children. I wouldn't let them go. I wouldn't let somebody drive them if I didn't know the driver. Like, I went on all the field trips when my kids were little, right? It wasn't accidental.
Yeah.
I'm going to drive, right?
Yeah.
Because I just couldn't, I didn't have the comfort that it was going to be okay. And I decided early on, which is part of why I like to say this to people, I didn't care what people thought. If people were like, oh, she is overprotective, you can think that all you want. And maybe I was, but that was one thing I just didn't trust them going off in a car with somebody. And my own coping to keep myself more calm would be around, I like to meditate. I like to do yoga. I take walks in nature. I write in my journal. Obviously, I'm a writer, and writing is, I love to meet myself on the page and things that is where I find solace, and I can make sense of things that might be challenging to make sense of in other ways. So I really did. I mean, I wrote stacks of journals through all my early grief and onwards. And then I had this illusion that I had a book because I kept all those journals. So I want to say to everybody out there who's writing their book, like, yeah, your journals are great. And for me, mine was like research.
Yes.
When I went to actually write my book, I would use my journals to remember.
Yes.
But I had to then write the book because
right, exactly.
Writing to myself is a totally different experience than writing to the world.
And also a reminder, it is not helpful to write your journals as if it's going to be a book someday. The
No,
therapeutic value of writing in your journals is to write in your journals. I wonder, as we close, because you are a writer professionally, in addition to having written your memoir, this exquisite book, when you think back over the decades that you've written in your journal in different seasons of your grief, early grief, and even later on, maybe, are there practices that you use, prompts that you found helpful, challenges that you give yourself in terms of writing, or the container of writing, or the space or the time? Or because, I think myself included, but so many people I've worked with over time like the idea of it, but haven't kind of found their way into it, or what makes it useful or meaningful. And of course, it's unique to all of us. I want to preface that, but what might you share that you've learned as both like as a writer, but more importantly, as someone who's used journaling and writing as a way of metabolizing your grief?
thank you for asking me that. I mean, early on, I just used it. I love, one of my friends would always say that page is a forgiving friend. So in the beginning, that is really how I used it. It was just for me, right? I had no thoughts about using it later or ever sharing it or anything. It was just a place where I could go and be with this forgiving friend. And over time, it's like, now even, so I think that writing prompts are great. I will give a little thing for art. My daughter and I run a writing group twice a year, usually in November and February. And I have come up with all kinds of prompts to help people. I love that you say metabolize, like to help people metabolize their grief. Because for me, it's so much more than the story that happens. If we can come about it, like I like to say, I open the door for people to come in to their grief sort of in a sideways way. So a lot
Yes.
of my prompts are around nature, fairy tales. Some of my favorite things that people have written. One of my favorite prompts is what's in your grief soup, right? And so like, what are the ingredients? How do you cook it? Wherever that takes you. And some of my favorite pieces are people have written
Coming
like,
from that.
yeah, what's in your grief soup? Because it's a different thing to think about making grief soup
Yeah.
than writing the story of what happened. I think it's important to also write the story of what happens. But if we want to start moving through our grief, to be able to come at it in different angles so we can
Yes.
get to this deeper meaning beyond the events that happened.
Yeah. And that's where the meaning making happens, right? Is in that process. And that's why I think that's why I love metaphor and poetry and prompts, is it helps us get at things. It gets at, as you said, sideways, or, truth told slant. I think, I don't know, Emily Dickinson or somebody said that, because it helps you also get at overwhelming concepts and experiences like the profound loss of your young husband in a way that feels too hard to do straight on. Yeah. So I
Yeah, if
love
instead,
that.
if I, one of the things that I do, I do it for myself regularly. I did it this morning. Like I will sit quietly and just check in with my body. I'm such a body writer, as you know, from reading me.
Yes.
And just check in with my body. Like, where is it today? And I literally will feel a twinge in some part of me. And that's where I start writing from. Like that spot in my body and what's going on there and what am I feeling? Because that's different from writing the events that happened.
Yes.
It gives me a doorway, a portal, and there's deeper meaning for me there.
Yeah. There's discovery there, right? As opposed to being sort of a regurgitator or a reporter of things. There's some meaning and some discovery that's available there.
Yeah, because I always want to be curious, right? That's because I don't know, right? I know, like, I am very grateful to have been on this planet as long as I have, and I've experienced a lot, and I've loved a lot, and I know this much, tiny compared to what's out there, right? So just for me to be curious, to be in a state of wonder, to
Yeah.
go investigate and see what's there.
Yeah. Well, I think curiosity is the thing, frankly, culturally we're missing, but individually we're missing. And I think is one of the most useful components of how we metabolize our grief, is to remain compassionately curious about our own lived experiences. And that's what I felt you did in your life. And certainly you did as a writer when you created this memoir, A Fifth Chamber, is you stayed curious and you helped us see inside, like where you wanted to wall off. And then when you pushed towards your curiosity and where you took risks and when you rested. And you just walked us through your life, a part of your life anyways. I know not your whole life, but a life story there. And I just thank you so much for sharing it with us. Readers, listeners, become readers and check out Annie Gudger's beautiful book, The Fifth Chamber. You are going to absolutely feel moved and also learn maybe a thing or two about navigating your own loss. Annie, thank you so much for being on air in conversation with me today, as opposed to our off-air conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always just a delight to get to spend time with you. And I'm so happy we could have this conversation today.
Thanks. All right, listeners. Well, stay tuned. Check out the show notes for the link to how to learn about Annie and maybe her writing workshops and where to get her book. Well, my friends, as promised, this conversation was so full of wisdom and heart and a bit of humor too, which is the same thing you'll find when you read Anne's extraordinary memoir, The Fifth Chamber. You can also learn more about her passion for grief through Coffee and Grief, a community that she co-founded and includes a monthly reading series focused on grief and a podcast called Coffee, Grief, and Gratitude. I've been fortunate enough to be a guest on both. You can learn more about her book, and her other grief platforms by visiting annegudger.com or following her on socials at Anne Gudger. By the way, that's ANNEGUDGER. Don't forget to look for video clips of our conversation on social media at Lisa Keefauver MSW, or watch the unedited video version on my YouTube channel at Lisa Keefauver MSW. If you loved our conversation, learned something from it, it would mean the world to us if you do a few simple things. First, simply share the episode with another griever who might just need it too. And if you do it on socials, make sure to tag me. Number 2, make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to this one or watched it so you don't miss the next episode when it drops. And while you're there, consider leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review. You could do it on Apple Podcast if you listened, or on YouTube if you watched. I read each and every one of your reviews, and they mean the world to me. Thanks to Giles Smith of Alafia Sounds for the music for our show. Okay, my grieving friends, remember that yes, grief is a sneaky bitch, but don't worry, I've got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.